And welcome to our fifth workshop in preparation for the Oxford Schools Tournament. My name is Elena, I'm one of your CAs, and in this workshop we're briefly going to cover rebuttal and how to go about doing it within debates. Because many of you are just getting started with debate, I think it's worth giving a bit of an intuition understanding of this concept. Effectively, rebuttal is just ways of attacking the arguments of the other side and kind of trying to poke holes within their case, such that you create more leeway for your own ideas and arguments to be put forward and understood by the judge. With that said, what we're going to cover in this little workshop is just firstly what rebuttal isn't and what doesn't count as proper rebuttal within debates. And then we're going to go through 3 techniques for attempting rebuttal and how to do it when you're faced with having to counter and to respond to the other side. But ahead of any of that, I just want to talk a bit about why you want to do rebuttal and why you want to dedicate some time or some proportion, depending on the type of speech you're giving from your speech, to this concept of rebuttal. And obviously, there's a lot of justifications. A few of them are, firstly, it has a huge persuasiveness function, right? If you're able to just show to the judge that many of the arguments of the other side are not as strong as they appear to be, or that many of the things that they're claiming are not actually true in real life, then that obviously makes you appear far more persuasive to the judge, which is one of the key functions and the key metrics on which you win. But secondly, I would say it's important to note that the judge cannot input themselves into a debate, which is to say they can't make a lot of value judgments upon the arguments. Anything else that the teams have not said. So if a team starts and puts forward an argument, even if that argument is quite weak or quite unsubstantiated, unless it is rebutted, that argument is going to stand in its full form by the end of the debate, and the judge is going to have to credit it, right? So the reason you want to do rebuttal and the reason you want to rebut stuff is merely because you don't want such arguments to stand by the end of the debate. You don't want the judge to have to insert themselves into the debate. And you also probably want to rebut the strong stuff so that you don't lose the debate. With that in mind, let us go through what isn't rebuttal. And there's 4 main things which I can talk about. The first one is just stating the sentence, they didn't prove this, or they didn't analyze this, or they didn't talk enough about this without going the extra mile or without explaining anything further, right? So I think it's important to understand that just saying they didn't do enough to prove is often not sufficient in fully destroying the claims of the other side, right? And that is because in debates, both sides are right to some extent, right? So if a team goes like X and another goes like X is speculative, but nothing further than that, X still stands. Because unless you prove why X is speculative, or unless you give some reasons why it's incredibly relevant that they didn't properly prove that X is relevant, then the judge can't really credit X being demolished just because you've said the word speculative, right? It's also quite intellectually shy in that it shows that you're not willing to properly engage with the term. You're just willing to name it as improper and then move on, right? So rebuttal has to be a very thorough engagement with the points of the other side. Second thing that is not rebuttal then is just a counterexample with no analysis to back it up, right? So if one team goes and argues some point, right, an argument, and the other team goes, oh, but in this very specific scenario, this analysis doesn't really stand, and this is a niche example that shows that they're not right, that's not really going to be credited very forcefully and very importantly in the debate. And that's generally because in debates, we tend to prefer deep analysis, which shows, systemic reasons or things that can apply to multiple scenarios rather than just like fringe examples with which the judge might probably not believe or might believe, but still don't understand whether that's an exception from the rule or an example of the rule. So whenever you use a counterexample, whenever you want to use a counterexample in your rebuttal, you should either make sure it is backed by a lot of analysis that shows that the understanding of the motion done by the other team is just not right, and that you're going to provide the counter analysis and then this counter example, or it should be an example representative of a wider category of concepts or of examples, right? So if your example is just like a model which shows an overall trend into something and you use it to rebut another trend that the other side has said, that is fine. What is not fine, however, to sum this up, is just having a team that goes with a lot of analysis and you just bringing one example and saying, because this example is true, then it means that their entire analysis is false. That example might just be an exception to the rule, and it's not not incredibly persuasive, nor is it incredibly destabilizing to the other team to just bring one example. Thirdly, then, only rebutting the other side's weakest arguments is also, I mean, it technically is rebuttal, but it is not advised to do this. And this is because it gives off the impression that you're really scared to engage with the most important material that the other side brings, right? And it's just incredibly not persuasive to see a team just pick at the very weak links and the very fringiest points of the other side, right? So just as a rule of thumb, when you attempt to rebut and when you first decide to rebut something, I think it's important to state that the time you spend on each rebuttal point should be proportionate with its relevance, right? So if the other side spends 4 minutes trying to build this incredibly important argument, which becomes one of the main classes within the debate, then you should obviously spend a significant amount of your rebuttal time trying to go at that specific argument. If they, however, say a small point within 10 seconds, don't pick up that point unless it is incredibly crucial and incredibly relevant, because then it means you're just wasting time on something that is not particularly important and is not going to be credited with a lot of weight within the debate. Lastly, then, on deflecting to your previous arguments when you rebut, right? This is basically saying, particularly if you're, for instance, a second speaker, right? And so, the other side brings forward an argument, and your only response to that argument is to just run back to your previous case or your previous arguments forwarded by your previous speaker and just run to those, right? And say, well, they said this, but we already said this, and then stopping there, right? Your job when you get rebutted by another team or when another team forwards arguments which are opposite to what you've previously said is to either respond to those with new material, right? To bring new things towards the debate, or to bring new things to your previous arguments, which strengthen them and then provide new responses for the other team, right? If you only say, well, they said X, but our response, and then you could just repeat what you had previously said within the debate, that's just going to be a waste of your time because it's not going to be credited as new responses. It's not going to be credited as rebuttal. It's effectively just going to be credited as you restating something that your partner has previously said. However, if you think that there is some response that you can give by using your previous argument, i.e., you want to respond to the other side by weaponizing your previous arguments in a way or another, you can definitely do that. This is to say your teammate speaks and puts forward some arguments, and then the other side says something entirely opposite, probably. And then what you can do is say, well, within that previous argument that my first speaker has said, there's this particular thing which can be used in this instance to provide a counterexample, to provide a counter-analysis for what we've heard from the other side. But crucially, it has to be new things that you're bringing to the debate. Just repeating things that your partner has previously said in arguments doesn't usually count as rebuttal. So then the question obviously becomes, what is rebuttal and how do you go about doing it? And I think I want to talk about 3 main strands of rebuttal that you can approach when you're in a debate. The first one is the most basic, and it's just attempting to prove that the arguments or points made by the other side are just untrue and something about them is just wrong. And this is obviously the easiest of them most of the times, just because it's quite straightforward how to do it. If you just look at an argument, try to figure out a place where it has a weak spot and attack that certain place, right? And so there's 3 main ways to do it, which I've outlined here. The first one is to try to identify an untrue premise, right? So obviously, if the other side forwards an argument that starts from a particular premise and you manage to prove that that premise is quite a flawed one because of some reasons you figure out, then the entire argument falls afterwards, right? You don't need to rebut every single little sentence or little bit within an argument. It is sometimes sufficient to just to rebut a very particular key component of the argument. And then obviously, if the premise of an argument is untrue, then the argument is rendered untrue, right? So as an example of this, because I know it can be quite abstract for people hearing this for the first time, say you have the motion, this house, as a parent with limited resources and multiple children in a developing nation, would choose to allocate a majority of resources towards the most talented child, as opposed to spreading them equally across all children, right? And so a proposition here might run some things about how you need quite a minimum amount of resources in order to make sure that that child is successful. And this is the best way that the parents maximize their chances of achieving a greater affluence, because if they put a lot of resources into this one child and this child becomes quite successful, then they can give a lot of money back to their parents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so if you're opposition here, one way you can rebut arguments coming from proposition is to just go, well, the premise of this entire point and the premise of this entire approach, right, to put most resources into this child is that the choice of which child you're going to put a lot of resources in is going to be a correct one, right? And that you're going to be able to properly pick as a parent one child to just like devote most resources to, when in reality that choice is likely to be skewed or biased because of many reasons, right? Perhaps you have some sort of like gender bias that you're using in making your choices. Perhaps you're using age as a determinant of whether or not that child is the most talented, right? Because usually it's the eldest siblings that are deemed to be the heads of the family and those that help their parents the most. Or perhaps you're using standard schooling systems with the things like standardized tests or just standardized ways of assessing how intelligent a child is in order to then replicate that and use that as a success metric, which is entirely wrong, right? So if you then manage to prove that this choice is likely to be a very incorrect choice and that the parent is not going to be able to figure out which the most talented person is, and thus likely to just invest a lot of resources in the kid that might not, in a kid that might not end up giving them back because they might not be the most talented one, then that's a way to sort of like poke a hole into an argument that says, oh, this kid is going to be successful and then get a lot of money back by pinning it onto this choice that is likely to be flawed. So you see how then any discussion is changed because you've managed to prove that at the very beginning, when this choice is being made, there are a lot of issues with the parents' capacities to make this choice. Secondly, then on rebuttal techniques, you can try to attempt to show that there are flawed logical links within an argument, right? So an argument is most likely going to be composed of a lot of points and a lot of steps from a point to another, right? So you try to prove X, and then you try to prove that X means Y, and then you try to prove that Y means Z, and then you show that Z is bad, right? So if you're able to break one of these steps, break one of these chains that tie together moving parts of an argument, then you're obviously able to significantly attack the argument, right? So just very intuitively, again, on a motion like this House decriminalize drugs, right? If there's an argument that says, this time on opposition, right, that decriminalizing drugs is going to lead to a massive increase in consumption, and that a lot of people are just all of a sudden going to start doing drugs. One way to go about sort of rebutting that is sort of like attack the link, attack this very specific link that making it legal makes a lot of people consume by showing sort of counter reasons why people consume drugs. They don't do it necessarily because it's legal or not, but they do it because of, I don't know, addiction, or they do it because they've been influenced at a very young age, or they do it because of many systemic reasons that don't have to do with whether drugs are criminalized or not criminalized. So it's untrue that the legal status of drug consumption within the specific country heavily influences the decision of someone to do or don't do drugs, which means definitely then all of the impacts that the argument might try to prove, such as effects and issues with like the health of consumers, or many issues within society and social behavior, those are not going because if you manage to prove that there is not a connection between the legal status of drugs and their consumption, then you've broken up that argument. Lastly, then, in terms of just rendering things usually untrue and just massively decreasing their credibility within the debate, is to just show that, you have a problem solution mismatch, right? So what this usually allows you to do is just show that the impacts of the argument are not what the rest of the argument kind of wants there to be, right? Let me give you an example of this. Say you want to argue about climate change, right? And you want to argue about figuring out solutions to climate change, and you spend out a lot of time within an argument trying to prove obviously why climate change is incredibly dangerous and why a lot of action needs to be taken. And then your solution for that is, for instance, to ban plastic straws, right? Obviously, banning plastic straws is going to have some sort of impact, albeit quite small. But that's the biggest issue, right? That within this whole context, the problem that this team has identified is incredibly big, right? Like figuring out climate change and stopping the world from burning. But then the solution that they provide is not itself able to stop that problem from happening, right? So this is another way through which you can render some sort of arguments to be untrue or largely not able to fulfill the task or the burden or the aim that they've set themselves to fulfill. Secondly, then, you can prove that an argument is symmetric. So you do this, for instance, say you're in a debate and you're debating against quite a good team that has made quite good arguments. You don't know how to attack the arguments using these techniques, right? You analyze the arguments, you're like, the premises seem right, the logical links seem fine. There doesn't seem to be a huge problem solution mismatch within these. So then what do you do then, right? Another option that you have is to just prove symmetry, right? What this essentially means is that the harms that the other side brings to the debate exist on both sides of the house, regardless of whether we support or oppose the motion, right? Essentially, what you're trying to do with this is to just try to mitigate or to minimize the extent of harm that the other side is trying to prove, right? So if they go, there is this massive amount of harm on their side of the house and we're able to solve it through the motion, then you can easily go, well, does the motion actually solve that harm, or is that harm just something that is a true fact about the world, unlikely to be changed about the decision of the motion, right? Again, as an example, to give you an intuition bump, if you have, for instance, the motion, this house is FIFA would boycott the World Cup in Qatar, right? Usually proposition would probably argue this based on human rights violations that have happened in Qatar in order to build the stadiums and build the infrastructure that then sustained the World Cup, right? And so, if there's a lot of talk, if for instance, proposition starts talking a lot about the regime in Qatar and about how workers are treated incredibly badly, etc., then one way to go about this isn't necessarily to try to prove that it's untrue, because perhaps it is true, but rather to try to prove that that is a fact that exists both on propositions and sort of on opposition's case, that workers are going to be treated badly on both sides of the house. And it's unlikely that this particular boycott done by FIFA is going to massively restructure and change the architecture, the social architecture within Qatar, right? So then you can just start asking questions about the purpose of FIFA and whether or not it should associate itself with it. But largely, if a team just tries to say that through this, you're going to be able to change the whole system in Qatar, then you can probably prove that that's unlikely to be true and that the harm to workers is likely to be quite similar on both sides of the house. And let's just go into more nuanced comparisons that you can draw. Lastly, on the last way to approach trying to decredibilize the other side is this idea of weighing, which is not exactly particularly rebuttal, but it sort of extends from it. Again, say you have you're debating a team that seems to have quite good arguments. Nothing about them seems icky. All of them seem quite true. You can't prove any sort of symmetry. You can't prove that the same harms or the same benefits exist on both sides of the house. What do you then do? What you do then is attempt to compare the two arguments or compare the 2 points against one another, right? So acknowledge the fact that what they're saying is true and it is fair. And acknowledge, obviously, that what you are saying is true and is fair, and then try to find ways to compare to choose which true and fair thing the judge should pick. And so there's 3 criteria for doing this, the 3 most basic criteria for doing this. Firstly, it's by quantity, right? And again, to give you an intuition pump, if their arguments harm, say, 100 people, and your arguments harm 5 people, then obviously your arguments are going to be preferable to them because there's less people being harmed by the thing itself, right? This is particularly relevant when you're discussing things like, certain policies that might extend towards either the majority of the population or some particular minorities, right? Or when you're discussing any sort of policy or any sort of motion that discusses the action of some actor against another, quantity is just a good way to weigh them against one another. Secondly, you can weigh things by size of harm, right? So obviously, again, numbers are important. And if you manage to prove that you have a significant benefit for so many more people than the other side, then that's a good way to compare. But sometimes that's not enough, right? Or sometimes you can manage to choose to show to the judge why your arguments are preferable by showing that even though, for instance, their arguments harm sort of more people, your arguments harm more people, their arguments, even though they harm less people, they harm those less people more intensely, right? To again give you an intuition pump for this, if you sort of said something quite bad, which harmed, like made 5 people feel incredibly bad, just by virtue of using words, then that's probably not ideal, but it's still probably preferable than slapping 2 people, right? Because that's a greater size of harm most of the times than sort of just like using certain words, right? This is obviously a bad example to illustrate this, but you kind of get the point, right? So you don't have to necessarily show that your arguments are good for most people. If you manage to show that there is a qualitative basis on which your arguments are better, then that's a good way to weigh against the other sides. And lastly, then on short versus long-term impact, sometimes it's very good to think about sort of whether or not the benefits or the harms that you/they are talking about extend within the immediate term or have long-term ramifications, which are more important, which is basically to say, their arguments might be quite good on the short term. They might have quite good effects right now, but maybe 10 years down the line, they're going to have very drastic outcomes, which you want to prevent. So that's also a very good way of assessing the arguments of another side, or of comparing your arguments with the arguments of another side, by just going, maybe in the short term, they might win. They might have more benefits than we do. Maybe this year, this particular month, their arguments are going to be better. But if you look down the line in 5 years' time, our arguments are clearly more important, because in 5 years' time, their arguments are going to have so many more side effects that they don't account for, that they don't realize now, which are going to be so much worse. So we would rather do the smarter, more respectable, more sensible thing of choosing the long-term impact and choosing the long-term good. So this has pretty much been it. I hope this has been clear. I hope you now have a broader picture of what rebuttal can look like and what rebuttal can, how rebuttal can help you within the debate and how to go about doing it. And all the best. Have a nice day.